Der Metall schrien, bevor die Bullets erreift. German Soldaten crouched in hedgerows across Normandy, lernte zu recognizen der Sound. Ein mechanischer Rohr, das präzise des bei Fraktionen einer Sekunde. Sie kalten es die Höllenfeuer, die Hellfire. Andere wisperten einen anderen Namen, won das spähte durch Wehrmacht-Ranks like a contagion of fear, Donners Schlag der Hölle, der Thunder of Hell. Der Waffe, die diesen Namen erlangte, war nicht ein Tank, nicht ein Artilleriepiece, sondern ein amerikanischer Maschinengun, der Browning M2, feiern 50 Kaliber-Rounds at einem Härte, der turned Air into Perkussion und Fleisch into Memory. Im Sommer von 1944, als Allied Forces pushed inland von den Beaches, German troops discovered, dass deren Assumption about American firepower hat been katastrophal, fatally wrong. Obergefreiter Hans Weber crouched behind dem stone wall of a Norman farmhouse, sein Reife useless gegen das Sound hammerende Air abobe ihm.
He had survived the Eastern Front, had endured Stalingrad's frozen hell, had watched friends die in mud and snow. None of it had prepared him for this. The American half-track sat 300 meters distant, its turret swiveling with mechanical indifference. When the gun opened fire, the world compressed into noise and terror. Stone exploded into powder. Wood splintered into splinters that became shrapnel. The wall that had seemed solid moments before now disintegrated under a stream of projectiles, each weighing over 40 grams, traveling at nearly 900 meters per second. Weber pressed his face into dirt that trembled with each impact, tasting soil and fear in equal measure. His squad leader screamed orders that no one could hear over the thunder. 3 men tried to retreat across the courtyard. The M2 traversed left, a casual movement, almost lazy. When the firing stopped 5 seconds later, nothing remained of those men but red mist settling slowly in the summer air.
Weber understood then what his commanders had failed to grasp. The Americans had not come to fight a war of attrition. They had come to erase resistance through overwhelming mechanical violence. The mythology of German tactical superiority died in hedgerows and villages across France, murdered by a weapon that predated the war itself. The Browning M2 had entered service in 1933, a modification of John Browning's original design from the First World War. American ordnance officers had recognized its potential immediately, but the weapon's true nature revealed itself only in combat, where theoretical performance became lived reality. The M2 fired a round originally designed for anti-tank work, the 50 caliber BMG cartridge, Browning machine gun, a bullet so large that soldiers joked you could see it in flight if you were unlucky enough to be standing in its path. Each round carried energy equivalent to a small artillery shell, capable of penetrating light armor, destroying vehicles, and rendering cover into illusion. German troops had faced machine guns before, the MG-42 with its terrifying rate of fire, the Soviet Maxim guns that had torn through their advances in Russia. But those weapons fired rifle-caliber ammunition, 7.92mm rounds that could kill a man, but rarely could destroy the structures he hid behind. The M2 operated on a different principle entirely. It did not suppress, it annihilated. Wehrmacht's tactical doctrine emphasized movement, infiltration, the use of terrain for concealment and protection. German infantry trained to advance under covering fire, to use stone walls and buildings as shields, to close distance before engaging. These tactics assumed that machine gun fire, while deadly, could be survived through proper use of cover. The M2 invalidated those assumptions with physics. A 50 caliber round striking a brick wall did not ricochet or embed. It punched through, creating exit holes the size of dinner plates, sending fragments of brick and bullet through anyone sheltering behind. Trees that stopped rifle fire shattered when the M2 engaged them, trunks exploding in cascades of splinters that became secondary projectiles. Sandbag positions that provided adequate protection against small arms offered no defense at all when each incoming round weighed as much as 5 normal bullets and carried 10 times the kinetic energy. German soldiers discovered that their training had prepared them for a different war, one where cover meant safety rather than merely delaying death by seconds.
The psychological impact exceeded even the weapon's devastating material effects. Human beings evolved to assess threats through pattern recognition, to learn from experience what dangers to fear and how to avoid them. Machine gun fire in previous wars followed predictable patterns.
A soldier could learn to time his movements between bursts, to recognize when a gunner reloaded, to understand the weapon's limitations and exploit them. The M2 defied such learning. Its rate of fire, between 450 and 550 rounds per minute, created a rhythm that felt almost leisurely compared to the MG42's buzzsaw cadence. But that slower rhythm carried its own terror, each round distinct and separate, each impact a small earthquake of destruction. German troops reported that you could hear individual bullets striking, metal meeting matter with sounds like hammers on anvils, each percussion a reminder that the next round might find you. The weapon fired from belt-fed ammunition boxes holding 100 rounds, and American crews carried dozens of belts. Reloading took seconds. Cooling between bursts happened passively, air flowing over the barrel shroud. The gun could fire and fire and fire, sustaining rates that exhausted gunners before exhausting ammunition. Feldwebel Otto Kraus led his platoon through the Bocage country south of Saint-Lô, navigating the maze of hedgerows that had slowed the American advance to a crawl. His men moved with confidence born of experience, using the ancient earthen walls topped with vegetation as both concealment and protection. They had fought Americans before, had measured their enemies' capabilities, and found them wanting in infantry skill despite their superiority in equipment. Kraus had told his men that Americans preferred to call in artillery rather than fight close, that their infantry lacked the aggression and tactical sophistication of German troops. He had believed this, had staked his life and the lives of his soldiers on this assessment. The American column appeared on the road below their position, half-tracks and trucks moving with careless speed that spoke of either ignorance or arrogance. Kraus smiled. They would teach these invaders the cost of carelessness. He gave the signal. Panzerfaust teams raised their weapons. Riflemen took aim. Before anyone could fire, the world became thunder. The lead half-track's turret had been pointed skyward, the gun crew apparently relaxed, inattentive. But the traverse motor engaged with sudden speed, the barrel dropped to horizontal, and the M2 opened fire in one continuous, devastating burst that transformed 3 seconds into eternity. The hedgerow that had seemed impenetrable exploded. Centuries-old earth and root structure, walls that had survived medieval wars and modern plowing, disintegrated under impacts that sent soil and vegetation and fragments of men into the air in a brown and green and red cloud that hung over the position like a death shroud. Kraus felt the hedgerow beneath him shake as if an earthquake. He pressed himself flat, fingers clawing earth, mouth open in a scream that produced no sound against the overwhelming noise. When silence returned, gradual and ringing, he raised his head. Of his 23 men, 6 remained alive. The hedgerow that had protected German defenders for weeks looked as though it had been chewed by some massive beast, a gap torn through vegetation and earth wide enough to drive a truck through. American infantry had not even dismounted. They had not needed to. The technical specifications explain some of the M2's effectiveness, but numbers alone cannot capture the weapon's psychological dominance. The 50 caliber round, formerly designated the 12.7 mm by 99 mm BMG, delivered approximately 18,000 joules of muzzle energy, compared to roughly 3,500 joules for the standard German rifle cartridge. This differential meant that the M2 round carried 5 times the energy of a rifle bullet, energy that had to go somewhere when the round impacted. In human targets, the results defied medical description. Soldiers struck by 50 caliber fire often simply came apart, the hydraulic shock of impact and the massive wound channel creating injuries incompatible with continued existence as an organized biological entity. German medical personnel reported cases that haunted them for decades, wounds that could not be treated because there was nothing left to treat, casualties that had been transformed from soldiers into abstract representations of violence's ultimate expression. The weapon's effective range extended beyond 2,000 meters for area targets, far exceeding the ranges at which infantry combat typically occurred. This meant that German positions could be engaged from distances where return fire proved impossible, where the only response was to withdraw or die. The M2's mounting options multiplied its tactical applications, and thus its psychological impact. American forces mounted the weapon on virtually every vehicle in their inventory. Jeeps carried single M2s on pedestal mounts, giving reconnaissance units firepower equivalent to a light tank's secondary armament. Half-tracks mounted either single or twin 50s, the twin mount providing such volume of fire that German troops reported physically pushed backward by the pressure waves of passing rounds. Tanks carried 50s as secondary weapons, used for suppressing enemy infantry and engaging light vehicles. Even aircraft mounted versions of the weapon, though the ground combat variant created its own legend. This ubiquity meant that German soldiers could never predict when they might face the weapon. A seemingly innocuous American patrol might include a Jeep with a 50, capable of destroying a German position in seconds. A routine convoy might include half-tracks whose defensive armament exceeded the offensive firepower of an entire German infantry company. The uncertainty compounded the fear. Wehrmacht troops learned to regard every American vehicle as potentially carrying thunder, learned to calculate engagement distances based not on their own weapons ranges, but on the M2's reach, learned to retreat at the first sound of that distinctive mechanical roar. By August of 1944, as American forces broke out from Normandy and began their race across France, German after-action reports documented a pattern of tactical paralysis. Units that had fought effectively in Russia, that had held positions against overwhelming odds, that had counterattacked with skill and aggression, now withdrew at first contact with American armored columns. Officers reported that their men, veterans of years of combat, refused to hold defensive positions within M2 range. Soldiers who had stood firm against Soviet armor broke and ran when American half-tracks appeared. The psychological effect had begun to exceed the weapon's material impact. Units withdrew not because the M2 had destroyed their positions, but because they knew it could, because the memory of that thunder and the sight of what it did to human bodies had broken something fundamental in their understanding of survivable combat. Wehrmacht's tactical doctrine emphasized willpower and aggression as force multipliers, the idea that superior morale and fighting spirit could compensate for material disadvantages. The M2 demonstrated the limits of that philosophy. No amount of courage or determination could make a stone wall stop 50 caliber rounds. No tactical skill could make an earthen embankment provide cover against a weapon that excavated fortifications with kinetic energy. German soldiers were not cowards for fearing the M2. They were realists, making calculations of survival that their training and their officers' exhortations could not override. The weapon's industrial origins amplified its psychological impact in ways its designers never intended. The M2 embodied American industrial might, the capacity to produce overwhelming firepower in quantities that made individual weapons expendable. Where German machine guns represented precision engineering, complex mechanisms produced in limited numbers by skilled craftsmen, the M2 reflected mass production philosophy. American factories produced the weapon by the thousands, mounted them on tens of thousands of vehicles, supplied them with ammunition measured in hundreds of millions of rounds. German troops captured American supply dumps and found mountains of 50 caliber ammunition, crates stacked higher than a man could reach, more rounds than a German infantry division would fire in a year of combat. This abundance spoke to a kind of power that German soldiers, raised in a nation where scarcity had defined civilian life since before the war, found almost incomprehensible. The M2 represented not just firepower, but the economic and industrial foundation that made such firepower routine, ordinary, distributed so widely that it became the standard rather than the exception. German veterans of the Eastern Front had seen Soviet weapons produced in staggering quantities, rifles and machine guns and artillery pieces churned out by factories that valued volume over refinement. But Soviet weapons, numerous as they were, fired conventional ammunition at conventional velocities. The M2 combined American industrial capacity with genuine technological superiority, creating a weapon that was both ubiquitous and devastating, common and terrifying. Unteroffizier Friedrich Mann survived the Falaise Pocket, the catastrophic encirclement that destroyed 2 German armies in August 1944.
He escaped on foot, part of a stream of survivors who stumbled eastward through burning villages and past abandoned equipment, haunted by the sound of Allied aircraft and the thunder of artillery. Years later, interviewed by historians, he struggled to describe the experience of that retreat. The specific engagements blurred together, battles merging into a continuous nightmare of noise and death. But certain moments retained their clarity, burned into memory with photographic precision. He remembered a village, its name lost to time and trauma, where his depleted company took shelter in stone buildings that promised protection from the shell fire that had pursued them for days. American armor appeared at the village edge, half-tracks and tanks moving with the confidence of hunters who knew their prey was cornered. The tanks fired, high explosive rounds that demolished walls and buried men in rubble.
Then the half-tracks engaged, their 50s hammering at buildings that had survived centuries of warfare. Man watched through a shattered window as the house across the street came apart. Not slowly, not piece by piece, but in a sudden, cascading collapse. As 50 caliber rounds punched through walls designed to stop musket balls and even artillery fragments. The building's facade dissolved like sand before water, and he understood with absolute certainty that the walls protecting him would offer no more resistance than paper. His company commander ordered withdrawal. They fled through back alleys, leaving equipment and wounded behind, running until exhaustion replaced fear, and fear returned to replace exhaustion. Man remembered looking back and seeing the village disappear into smoke and dust, erased from the landscape by American firepower that seemed inexhaustible, overwhelming, inhuman in its mechanical efficiency.
He remembered thinking that this was not war as he had been trained to fight it. This was extermination, the methodical destruction of resistance through application of force so disproportionate that survival became statistical improbability rather than tactical achievement. The nickname evolved through the summer and fall of 1944, spreading through Wehrmacht units as survivors shared their experiences. Thunder of Hell captured multiple dimensions of the M2's impact. There was the literal thunder, the hammering cacophony of the gun firing, sound that assaulted eardrums and created pressure waves felt in the chest. There was the thunder of impact, rounds striking targets with percussive force that shook earth and stone. There was the metaphorical thunder of American power, the industrial storm that had been unleashed against Germany.
And there was hell itself, the apocalyptic destruction the weapon inflicted, scenes of carnage that defied soldiers' ability to process trauma and maintain sanity. German troops who faced the M2 reported nightmares that persisted for years, dreams of thunder and disintegrating walls and bodies coming apart in red mist. Some developed acute sensitivity to loud noises, flinching at backfiring engines or slamming doors, conditioned by combat to associate sudden sound with imminent death. The psychological casualties mounted alongside the physical. Men who emerged from battle physically intact, but mentally shattered by exposure to violence on a scale their minds could not successfully compartmentalize. The weapon's legend grew through comparison and contrast with other feared Allied weapons. Soviet troops had employed massed artillery and tank armies, overwhelming force applied without sophistication but with devastating cumulative effect.
British forces had demonstrated methodical tactical excellence, coordinated combined arms operations that ground German defenses down through systematic pressure. The Americans brought something different, a fusion of industrial abundance and technological lethality that manifested in weapons like the M2. Where a German MG-42 team might have 500 rounds of ammunition, an American M2 crew had 5,000, 10,000, more than they could possibly fire in a day of continuous combat. Where German gunners aimed carefully, rationing ammunition and selecting targets, American M2 gunners engaged anything that might conceal enemy forces, demolishing buildings and vegetation with fire that seemed limitless. This profligacy with ammunition reflected deeper truths about American material superiority, the capacity to waste what German forces hoarded, to expend in minutes what took their enemy weeks to accumulate. The M2 became symbolic of this disparity, a weapon that could only exist within an industrial system capable of producing and supplying it at scales German industry, crippled by Allied bombing and raw material shortages, could not hope to match. By late 1944, as German forces withdrew into the Reich itself, the thunder of hell followed them. American armored divisions rolled through the Siegfried Line, their vehicles mounting 50s that engaged bunkers and pillboxes designed to stop tanks. The fortifications that had cost millions to construct, emplaced weapons designed for static defense, fell to combinations of artillery, tank fire, and sustained M2 bombardment that demolished firing apertures and made positions untenable. German defenders found that even concrete, the ultimate defensive material, provided only temporary protection. 50 caliber rounds could not penetrate thick concrete directly, but sustained fire could chip and spall it, could destroy observation ports and weapon slits, could make positions uninhabitable through the simple expedient of continuous, overwhelming violence. Bunker crews that survived the initial assault often emerged to surrender rather than endure the psychological torture of walls shaking under impacts, of concrete dust filling the air until breathing became a struggle, of knowing that eventually the ammunition would penetrate, or the structure would collapse, or they would simply lose their minds from the noise and pressure and terror. The technical evolution of the M2 during the war demonstrated American capacity for continuous improvement, for identifying problems and solving them through engineering rather than exhortation. Early models had struggled with barrel overheating during sustained fire, a limitation that reduced the weapon's practical rate of fire below its theoretical capabilities. American ordnance engineers developed quick-change barrel systems that allowed crews to swap barrels in seconds, maintaining firing rates by rotating between multiple barrels as each heated and cooled. They improved the belt feed mechanism, making it more reliable under combat conditions. They developed specialized ammunition types, armor-piercing incendiary rounds that could destroy vehicles, tracer rounds that allowed gunners to observe trajectory and correct aim in real time. Each improvement made the weapon more effective, more reliable, more feared. German intelligence services documented these developments through captured equipment and prisoner interrogation, reporting back to commands that increasingly recognized the M2 as a significant tactical problem without possessing solutions. German attempts to develop analogous weapons failed, limited by industrial capacity and by the fundamental question of ammunition supply. Even had German industry produced an equivalent weapon, keeping it fed with ammunition at the rates American forces sustained proved impossible within Germany's collapsing logistical system. The personal accounts of German soldiers who faced the M2 carry similar patterns, narrative structures that recur across hundreds of testimonies. There is the moment of first encounter, often described with detailed sensory precision, the sound, the impact, the visceral physical reaction of fear. There is the recognition that previous tactical knowledge has become obsolete, that training and experience provide no guidance for surviving this weapon. There is the calculation, sometimes conscious but more often instinctive, that remaining in position equals death and retreat offers the only chance of survival. There is the guilt that follows, shame at having broken under fire, at having abandoned comrades or positions, at having failed to meet the standards of courage and duty that military culture demanded. And there is the understanding, arrived at gradually or suddenly, that no amount of courage would have changed the outcome, that the M2 represented a form of violence against which traditional military virtues provided no defense. These accounts describe not simply a weapon, but a crisis of military identity, the collision between conceptions of honorable combat and the mechanical reality of industrial warfare. German soldiers had been raised on narratives of military glory, tales of Prussian discipline and tactical brilliance, stories in which superior will and training overcame material disadvantages. The M2 belonged to a different narrative entirely, one where industrial capacity determined outcomes and individual courage became statistically irrelevant. The weapon's post-war legacy extended the psychological impact across generations. German veterans who survived the war brought their memories home, sharing stories with families and communities trying to understand the catastrophe that had consumed their nation. The thunder of hell appeared in these accounts as both literal weapon and metaphor for American power, the industrial and economic might that had crushed German resistance through sheer material preponderance. Children of veterans grew up hearing about the .50 caliber, about the sound it made, and what it did to human bodies and fortifications. The nickname persisted in German military culture, used even decades later to describe the M2 when discussion turned to Allied weapons and German tactical experiences. American occupation forces stationed in Germany after the war sometimes demonstrated the M2 at firing ranges, and German observers would watch with mixed fascination and remembered fear, seeing again the weapon that had haunted their father's generation. The gun became part of cultural memory, symbolic of the war's lessons about industrial warfare and the limits of traditional military virtues when confronting overwhelming material superiority. The M2 continued service long after the war's end, remaining in American military inventory through subsequent conflicts in Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf, Afghanistan, and beyond. Each generation of American soldiers learned to operate the weapon, learned its quirks and capabilities, learned to appreciate its power and reliability. Few of them knew that German soldiers had called it Thunder of Hell, that the weapon they used for suppressive fire and vehicle defense had once inspired terror in veterans of the Wehrmacht. The nickname faded from American consciousness while persisting in German military history, a reminder of the war's psychological dimensions and the ways that individual weapons could come to embody larger forces and fears. Modern militaries studied the M2's design principles, the combination of hitting power, reliability, and relative simplicity that made the weapon effective across nearly a century of service. The .50 caliber round remained in production, its ballistics and terminal effects unchanged from the cartridge that had devastated German positions in 1944. The weapon's longevity testified to the soundness of its design and to the peculiar requirements of modern combat, where the ability to destroy vehicles, penetrate cover, and engage targets at extended range retained value despite dramatic changes in military technology. The contrast between the M2 and contemporary weapon systems illuminates the broader evolution of military technology and tactical doctrine. Modern infantry combat emphasizes precision, the use of guided missiles and smart munitions to destroy specific targets with minimal collateral damage. The M2 represented an earlier philosophy, area saturation through overwhelming firepower, the destruction of any position that might harbor enemy forces. Both approaches reflect the technological and industrial capacities of their eras, shaped by what is possible and what is necessary. The thunder of hell that German soldiers heard in Normandy's hedgerows and France's villages was the sound of industrial modernity applied to combat without restraint. The noise of American economic power translated into kinetic energy and directed at targets that had assumed stone and earth could still provide sanctuary in modern warfare. The final question that German Soldaten who faced the M2 often asked themselves, in quiet moments after the war when memories surfaced unbidden, was whether they could have done anything differently. Could better tactics have mitigated the weapon's effectiveness? Could different training or equipment have provided answers to the problem it posed? The conclusion most reached, reluctantly and with lingering shame, was no. The M2 succeeded nicht weil German Soldaten lacked courage or skill, but because it represented a category of weapon against which individual tactical excellence provided no reliable defense. The thunder they had heard was not merely the sound of a machine gun firing, but the sound of their own tactical and material obsolescence, the noise of a new kind of warfare that rendered previous certainties meaningless. They had fought with honor and determination against a weapon that made those qualities insufficient for survival,
had learned through bitter experience that modern industrial warfare favored the nation that could produce and supply the most devastating tools of violence, rather than the army that best embodied traditional military virtues. The nickname they gave the weapon, Thunder of Hell, captured this recognition, acknowledging the M2 as something beyond normal military experience, a manifestation of violence so overwhelming that it transcended tactical categories and entered the realm of existential threat. For the men who survived their encounters with it, the memory of that thunder never entirely faded, remaining always in the background of consciousness, ready to return at the sound of heavy machinery or distant percussion, a reminder of the day they learned that walls could explode and bodies could disintegrate, and courage alone could not stop metal moving at 900 meters per second.